but welcome back to session 2 of our 2023 Spring Forum. And I'm delighted to have Keith join us from Sheffield/Leicester. Speaking from Sheffield and talking about work that's gone on in University of Leicester. Tweet again, put questions in the chat again, all the same sort of stuff. Please, Keith, tell us all about the toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organisers of today for adding me to the menu for today and tomorrow's Spring Forum. I'm Keith Nockels. I'm the academic librarian, which is what we call our subject librarians for medicine and healthcare, those two schools at the University of Leicester. So Leicester has had a medical school since the mid-1970s, and in the last few years we've started courses in nursing and midwifery, which we've added to a course in operating department practice, which has been going for a little longer. We also took over a physiotherapy degree, which belonged to another university and had a Leicester cohort, and that's now ours. And the School of Healthcare, which runs all of those things that are not medicine, is expanding quite rapidly, so there may be more new courses. I also convene the library's Inclusive Collections group, a little more about them in a moment. And I think I fall into all of the non-minoritized groups that it is possible to fall into. So I am learning an awful lot from that process of convening the group. And I hope the group is accomplishing good things. I think it is. So I want to talk you through this Diversifying Your Reading List Toolkit, which is a specific tool which is designed to help academics evaluate their reading list with regard to diversity issues. And I want to look particularly at how it works with health subjects. And I'm very much interested in hearing what you think of it. So please do put questions and comments in the chat. You've got my contact details on the slide there if you'd rather contact me afterwards. I'm going to give you a little bit of background so you know where the tool came from. I've been involved in presentations about this toolkit in other fora, where we talked more about the background and less about the actual toolkit. So if you have heard about it before, I hope it's not going to be too much of a repeat of what you hear now. So I have some people to acknowledge. First of all, I'll put all of the things up on the slide. So my colleague Hina Karavajra, who's another academic librarian who runs the Library Champions project. Our Library Champions project is a project for student volunteers, and each year we recruit some to work on specific projects that we've come up with. And the toolkit was one such project over a couple of years. So 2 years worth of Library Champions have been involved in it. And Khadija Kalalesh, whose name you see on the slide, was involved in both years. She was a champion for 1 year and came back as a Library Champion leader the next. I want to acknowledge all the members of the Inclusive Collections group who have overseen this project and other things that we have been doing. And also the Medical Schools MedRace group, a little bit about them later. But I value going to their meetings. So about that Inclusive Collections group, I've done my usual with slides and got the points appearing in the wrong order, so I'll put them all up. So we oversaw the toolkit project. We have members from all of the library team for the data specialist. We have an acquisition specialist. We have an archivist, as well as somebody who supports researchers and a number of people who support talk course students and teaching staff. And when the group was set up under a different name 3-4 years ago, I was invited to convene it, which I was very honoured to do and have learned a lot from. So we aim to support academic librarians who are working with academics who want to diversify their teaching or decolonise their teaching. We've had discussions about which of those words, so I may put both of them in. One of the things we do is to identify books, journals, collections that have the potential to diversify or decolonise the library's collections. So that might be things we would need to purchase, might be things we have purchased, it might be things that are free. And we also look at the print gifts which are offered to the library to look out for things that have that potential. We're starting to discuss issues about metadata, so some things that were talked about in the last presentation are of interest to us. So the metadata that's used in our own library catalogue, it might be words or phrases that are in titles, which are now offensive or harmful language. It might be things in descriptions. We're at the beginning stages of talking about that. We're trying to make links with institutional initiatives. So we have an Institute for Inclusivity in Higher Education within the university, which was set up quite recently to kind of steer the university in these sorts of things, and we're making links with them. We're making links with departmental initiatives, so MedRace would be an example of that, but other things in other subject areas. We're trying also to link what's going on in Leicester with what goes on in the wider library world, and also raise awareness in the library at Leicester of the sorts of issues that we talk about. So the work that led to our toolkit, our library champions 2-3 years ago tested existing schemes for evaluating diversity of reading lists, and the 3 that are listed on the slide are the ones that they tested. So an audit from Manchester Metropolitan University, a reading list tool from the University of Surrey, and the Northumbria Intersectionality Matrix. We'd heard about some of those at a Mercy and Collaboration conference that we helped to organise with our colleagues at De Montfort University, also in Leicester, in 2020. We found out about some from messages posted to the List Decolonise JISC list. And the results of that were presented at a meeting of Wealth in May 2021. When we gave the champions those 3 schemes to evaluate, we didn't say anything to them about what we thought about them. We let them look at them and evaluate them and feedback to us. Some of the things which they said are things that we would have spotted also. I'll put all these things up together. One piece of feedback was that all of these tools focused on author characteristics and not on the content of the items, and that it was difficult to discern those characteristics for a given person. So if somebody doesn't say anything about how they identify, it's rather difficult to work that out. You end up looking at photographs of them on their institution's website. That's rather a dangerous way to go. It was also pointed out that there might be differences between subject disciplines. So we had students from different disciplines looking at these schemes. 2 pieces of feedback from academics. So the library champions chose a reading list that they wanted to evaluate. They got the approval of the module leader, whose list it was. And there was some nervousness, I think, from academics that we were conducting some kind of audit of their list and that there might be consequences if they didn't have a certain quota. And it wasn't our intention to audit, and it certainly wasn't our intention to recommend quotas, although the university's racial inclusivity toolkit, which I'll mention again in a little bit, does sort of recommend one, but we weren't doing that. Maybe that says something about the state of higher education, that our academic colleagues felt they were being watched, but we reassured them about that, and they were happy for their lists to be examined. So the Diversifying the Reading Lit toolkit was developed by the next year's intake of library champions, taking into account that feedback. It also took into account feedback from the Students' Union, so some of us met with the diversity officers from the SU, and feedback from academic colleagues, so we presented a draft version of our toolkit to the Education Leaders Group at the university, which is Directors of Learning and Teaching. Very deliberately, it is not a checklist. We're not promoting it as one, it isn't one. So it's not a tick box. You don't tick boxes on a checklist, but it is instead a list of prompts designed to help colleagues consider the resources that they have on their list and consider whether diversity can be increased. It is designed for use in all subjects. Because of the nature of our health students' timetables, I don't think we've ever had any library champions from health courses. So preparing this presentation and your feedback as I go along will be very valuable in seeing how the checklist, how the toolkit fits health courses. We will develop it in the light of feedback. So there was discussion with the previous presentation about language. We've had to make choices about the language that's in our toolkit, and it may be that that's something that needs changing as time goes on, but also in the light of feedback from academic colleagues and librarians using the toolkit, and in the light of feedback from events such as this one. And we presented the toolkit, but not in as much detail as I'm about to do at Wealth in 2022, and also an EDI meeting at the UK Materials Group. So before I show you the toolkit, I should say, I might say it later, but in case I forget, I'll say it now. It is on the university's website, but not in a place where you can access it if you're not at the University of Leicester, because of the way the website is set up. So if you would like a copy of the toolkit, there is a PDF version I can send to you you can indicate you'd like it in the chat or contact me afterwards. So I think there are these things that I'd like us to have in mind as we go through our toolkit. One, of course, is that you might already have something like this. I know there are one or two other things out there in addition to the 3 schemes that our champions tested. So if you know of something or you have something, it'd be lovely to know about it. Interesting to know how well you think something like this toolkit would work in your own institution, and whether you'd need to change anything or you'd want to add anything or take anything away. I've prepared this presentation in the light of the courses, the health courses that we run at Leicester. There are some that we don't run, so it would be interesting to know how well you think it would work in those disciplines. And I think that's health things like occupational therapy, pharmacy, speech and language therapy, which we don't have. But I think also things like social work, which we also don't have. But I think there's enough issues in common between health and social work. So how well would our toolkit work in those areas? And I'll say a little at the end about what activities we've conducted in Leicester to encourage people to engage with the toolkit. And that's something for everyone to think about in the light of their own institution, I think, as to what you would do if you were to encourage others to use something like this, or you are already doing that. So I have a number of slides. They're headed toolkit. They have in them some of the prompts from that toolkit. I've numbered them for ease of reference, but the toolkit itself doesn't number them. And I'll talk you through those prompts section by section. There's a brief intermission for some material from the MedRace group. And then I want to 2 slides to end with. So the first section of prompts on our toolkit is these general points, which you can see on the slide. And I'll look at these in the light of what I think the issues are in health courses and health literature. I think the first and the third prompts relate to each other. What's the purpose of the reading list? Do students have to read everything on it? Is it just things they are recommended to read if they want to? Are there these distinctions made between compulsory reading and recommended and suggested? And do they get support in how they use the list which they are presented with? In the toolkit itself, the second prompt about non-academic sources, the suggestion is made that you might want to consider as an academic including non-academic sources for students who might want them. So that's something that to think about. The fourth prompt about what's regarded as being of most academic value, I think often, I guess, it will be the expected answer of books and journal articles, but maybe not. In some module lists, it might be guidelines, it might be clinical pathways, might be web resources, it might be anatomical atlases, sources of multiple choice questions. It could be different things. But could it also perhaps be autobiographical accounts of health or illness, people's blogs, people's biographies? The fifth prompt, not all of our modules lead to a research project, 1 or 2 of them do, but many of them do lead to assignments where there is the opportunity for students to undertake an assignment that relates to their experience. So they choose a topic to find an article about, to do a critical appraisal, for example. The sixth prompt, I think, is in the list, which remember is for use in all subject areas. It's there for courses that particularly have international students. We have some areas of study in the university where particularly we recruit international students. But in healthcare, that's 2 of our master's courses, one in diabetes, one in quality and safety in healthcare, which do have international students. Diabetes course is distance learning and attracts people from all over the world. We often have students from Saudi Arabia on the quality and safety in healthcare course who take their qualification and take that and their new knowledge home. So there's opportunity there to prompt reading list compilers to think if things, not necessarily publishers maybe, but research emanating from the home areas of the students. So that's the first set of prompts. The second set is to do with the origins of that reading material. So the toolkit does make the point about international publishers, that it might look like it's being published in Amsterdam or New York, but actually it's an international company, and that doesn't really mean quite so much. We tend to avoid, for many areas of healthcare, US published texts, which of course won't relate to our training structure, professional structure, health service structure. So that's true for courses in the School of Healthcare. It's true, I think, for the medical school as well. For 2 and 3, those 2 prompts, I think we might be looking for things that cover the UK. And so that's probably is going to be Eurocentric and global North-centric, but there are modules in global health where obviously that third prompt takes on a different angle. And the courses that have international students may well want material that covers different areas of the world, as we've said. And I wonder also whether we might want some material that covers something even more specific than the UK or England, and that would be material that relates to Leicester, Leicestershire, the English Midlands, where students are conducting their placements. The fourth prompt I found quite interesting when thinking about it from a healthcare point of view. There will be alternatives to Western views of health and illness and healthcare practice, and some of those might not be things you would get on the NHS. I'm thinking of things like traditional Chinese medicine. There may be a far better term for that, and Ayurvedic medicine, but the students will meet patients who've come across these things or perhaps even use those things. So there might be scope for including something about those alternative views. The fifth prompt about where the experiments took place, our reading lists tend not to include journal articles. The diabetes list does, the other ones tend not to, although students do have to go and find them. So this is perhaps a question more for teaching sessions rather than for people to think about when compiling reading lists. But that said, of course, the books that are on the list will report research. Will they report research that's representative? Will they report research that's recent? Those are things to bear in mind. And then the sixth prompt about organisations that would facilitate knowledge exchange from the global south. So we've talked as part of the previous presentation about things like Global Index Medicus. And as I mentioned in the chat during that presentation, I do now mention that as a source. And in certain groups that I teach, if they're at the point where they're doing dissertations and a bit more research, and why it is that they should consider Global Index Medicus and similar things as a way to counteract the fact that the so-called standard databases are not very good at indexing things published in the global south. Then there are some prompts about the content of the things on your reading list. And the section in the toolkit itself starts with the statement that authors or researchers may not be from an underrepresented group, but may discuss topics in a critical and decolonial way. This, I think, is something that the previous library champions did say. That's why looking at the content was useful, as well as looking at the characteristics of the authors. It occurred to me that the first prompt is worth asking with healthcare. Now, the toolkit says texts, maybe in the light of sources would be a better word, but do, for example, the books on women's health reflect women's experience of things like the menopause, or do they just report what us men think it's like? We've got no idea, of course. Do the things on the reading list influence the students in unhelpful ways? Do physiology books, how do physiology books cover the function of the female body, for example? I've never thought to check that, but it occurred to me that it might be something to look at. I could see how the second prompt relates to books about childbirth, books about mental health. But maybe it prompts us to think, and our academic colleagues to think, if the patient experience or family experience or carer experience is discussed in the books that are on the list, and if so, how. And it certainly applies to books that talk about the cultural culture of healthcare, cultural views of health and healthcare. There's more about the third prompt on the next slide in my little diversion into the work of the MedRace group, but there's also the issue, of course, if it's a book and there's a picture of somebody on the front cover, is that always a white male somebody? In the midwifery books, are the women always white? What about representation of transgender people in the books that are on our lists? So here's the brief intermission about MedRace. So MedRace is a student group. It has 2 student co-chairs, 2 staff co-chairs, and it was set up in response to the BMA's racial harassment charter. It discusses a wide range of issues. The first link on the slide, which I'll pop in the chat when they're done, gives you an idea of the other things that they've talked about. The second link on the slide is the work of one particular member of the group. Some members of the group have used a short optional study component of their medical degree to explore issues of diversity in specific areas of medicine. So, for example, they've been looking at representation of people of colour in dermatology teaching. So are all the images that are presented in the teaching of things like psoriasis and eczema, are they all showing it on white skin? Are there particular skin conditions that you're more likely to see in your patients if they are people of colour, and are those covered in the teaching? And also teaching about clinical signs. So there was a healthcare security investigation board, I think I've got that right, I hope so, report fairly recently about diagnosis of jaundice in newborns if the babies have black or brown skin, and whether that's covered. And somebody's been looking into that as well. And then the third thing on this about anatomy resources, that's come up in other meetings I attend. So obviously, if your anatomy app or anatomy atlas only shows male anatomy, it's no good for midwifery for a start, but it's also not a lot of good for quite a lot of other things either. And if the anatomy resource is showing skin, is the skin always white? So I'm grateful that MedRace are happy to have me at meetings. There's been points where, as there is in many meetings, of course, where the library is able to say, have you seen this? But there's been points where they have said to me, we know of this resource. So there's been one or two things which have been added to reading lists in medicine. Back to the toolkit. The next set of prompts is to do with the item itself. So that first one about the place of publication, we've met that already in another section. I think for textbooks, we may not be able to avoid the mainstream if there's a standard book on anatomy or pharmacology or nursing care of adults or whatever it is, it's quite likely to be a mainstream publisher. And for some health issues, maybe the non-mainstream is a bit too unorthodox, but maybe there are places where it could be included in a sort of context. That's a prompt worth having. So what about date? We'd all, I'm sure, want newer material, although in some areas older material might still be valuable. Maybe, I hope, this prompt is one to remind academic colleagues to check for the latest editions of things and the new editions of things, and not carry on using the edition that they have on their own bookshelves. I can but hope. Format, so diversity of formats might improve accessibility of what's on your list. We're currently discussing within the library and with our academic colleagues whether we shouldn't call them reading lists, whether we should call them resource lists instead, and whether that might encourage people to put things on the list which are not printed things to read. So if you've got podcasts or videos or social media, that goes back to one of the earlier prompts about non-academic sources, but it also might be a way to improve accessibility and present other viewpoints and underrepresented voices. The fifth one about language is quite an interesting one. I think if you were teaching French literature, I can quite see that you would want your students to have French. That's not quite the same issue in health courses, but I'm aware of language bias and systematic reviewing. And if you don't look at literature that isn't in English, you may be biasing the literature you're looking at. But of course, there's an immediate practical implication of that, in that what do you do if you don't have the languages in which that literature is written? We will have students who have other languages, and they could use material in those languages. It'd be difficult to put them on the lists because they won't all have the same language apart from having English. That's an issue, certainly in England. If I had French myself, I might put French language material on my reading list, but would students be able to read it? But I think it's a really good prompt. If you were studying health issues in Leicester, as some students might be doing for their dissertations, could you use material that's in community languages, in Gujarati or Somali or Hindi? How would you get it translated if you wanted to, if you didn't have that language yourself? If you did have that language yourself, could you use the material? If somebody's marking your work, would they have the same language as you? So a number of issues prompted by this prompt, not necessarily any straightforward answers. Then there are the prompts about the author's characteristics. So the first draft of our toolkit had these first, and it was pointed out to us by one of the groups that we presented the draft to that if we were saying it really wasn't just about author characteristics, why did we still have them at the top of the list? So we've moved them further down. It was a very fair point. There's that point made on an earlier slide about authors and researchers perhaps not being from an underrepresented group, but discussing topics in a critical and decolonial way. I'd wondered if there were issues also about who it is who writes in a particular area. Would it actually be possible for all the authors in a particular area of healthcare to be men? That's seeming less likely to me the more I think about it. And if it is an issue, if that really is the case, then that's another issue, isn't it? You can't put things by other authors if nobody else is writing. But is it actually that female researchers and writers writers from other communities are being ignored or overlooked? Is it the case that in some areas of healthcare, some of these prompts don't matter quite so much? In other areas, they obviously do. Or is it actually that we should consider it whatever the area of healthcare is? The third and fourth prompts, I think, engage with the thought that I had about, could you, for example, run a module on LGBTQ+ health if you didn't have any authors on your list who weren't LGBTQ+. The toolkit itself gives examples of identity, so things like gender and ethnicity, sexuality, class, disability. It does add the caveat from the feedback of that first tranche of library champions that there may not be a lot of information about author identities available. And where information is not explicitly available, it says on the toolkit, you shouldn't try to guess. The last category under identity is the author's contribution to knowledge and their significance in the field. So a prompt there definitely for looking for those ignored, overlooked, underrepresented authors. There's then a set of prompts about research studies. Now this ties in so very well with the presentation that we had before the break. And I was reminded of Ramona's the Appraising Anti-Racism Toolkit before that presentation. And as we've noted, our undergraduate reading lists don't tend to list research studies and articles, although these may be prompts to ask about the books that are on your list, but maybe they're prompts that might apply elsewhere in the curriculum, not necessarily on the reading list. So for example, our nursing students have an assignment where they need to find an article using the skills which they've encountered in library sessions, and they need to critically appraise it using a CASP checklist. So maybe these questions sit alongside that. And all the students, of course, when working on their final year projects, need to find the literature to support what they're doing, and they will need to appraise it. And maybe that's where these questions, or maybe even better, the anti-racism checklist would fit. So that's the last section of prompts. A little bit now about how we're promoting the toolkit at Leicester. So the curriculum consultant scheme is another scheme for students. They do get paid a little for participating in this one, so it's not volunteers, but it's a similar idea that there are projects that they can be involved in, which are put up there by different departments and schools. And Megan Jones, a psychology student, has been trialling the toolkit against 2 reading lists in psychology, which is her course. She's presenting all her findings, including some specifically about those 2 reading lists, at an internal meeting next week. She's happy that I mentioned her work to you, and I decided I'd mention the general feedback that she's given to us about the toolkit, which is that it is comprehensive, which is good to know. It's good at challenging the material on the reading list, which is very good to know as well. She's wondered if the toolkit could include information on how you could acknowledge diversity on your list by highlighting diversity of authors and viewpoints. And the Inclusive Collections Group, which oversees the toolkit, as I've mentioned, will certainly think about that. And also about adding information on how to overcome that lack of diversity. So if you've used the toolkit, you've decided that your list is not as diverse as it could be, what do you do? What we've said so far, and what we're saying as academic librarians, is of course that's where the library fits in. We may know of things, we may be able to help you find things, and we'd be interested to learn from our academic colleagues what things they know about, but maybe there's something that could go in the toolkit. We're starting to think of trialing the toolkit in other subject areas, so I've kind of made a start on that by making this presentation, I guess, but I like very much the idea of trialing it with 1 or 2 particular reading lists in the School of Healthcare, and that's something I'll be asking academic colleagues there about. We've promoted the toolkit internally, so it is now built into the process for approving new courses. So a colleague from our Education Services department within the university, which is where the learning technologists and the curriculum designers live. A colleague from that department is in the Inclusive Collections Group, and this toolkit is now part of the process for getting your new course approved. And she's going to work on ways to add it to the process for adding new modules to an existing course, so where it's just a module that needs approving. Our online reading list system, or resource list system, whichever it will be, the help files for that, the help pages for that include a link to this toolkit. The Racial Inclusivity Toolkit has been devised by the Institute for Inclusivity in Higher Education, as a way to help academics to diversify, decolonise their teaching and their curriculum. And there's a link from that toolkit to this one. And the Education Hub is a set of resources about teaching and learning and curriculum design and the use of learning technology, and it's linked from in there as well. Those are the two things which aren't accessible unless you're at the university. We've made a start on promoting the toolkit at meetings that we attend. So as academic librarians, we go to education committees, student staff committees, and similar things in the departments that we work with, and we've all made a start on promoting it there. And also to specific individual people that we've identified that we know have an interest, or who are the EDI lead in their course, sort of thing. And external promotion, well, of course, this is an example of that, and I'm rather hoping that academic librarian colleagues will have similar forums to this where they could present it in the groups that are within their own subject areas. I think I put the toolkit in response to a question on List Medical, but I might do that again in case my memory is at fault or the email has got lost, and also on List UHMLG, of course, and the List Decolonised list. So there's places like that where I'll promote it. There's also something called the Decolonisation Best Practice and Case Studies in Higher Education Libraries, a shared document. If I can find a link to it, I'll pop that in the chat when I've finished. And it's listed in that. That's an initiative to enable libraries to share this kind of work that they're doing. I think it's one of these areas where lots of people are doing lots of things, but we don't necessarily know what everyone is doing. And I think that is me. So thank you very much for listening. Questions and comments welcome. I can see there's lots of things in the chat.
There most certainly is, Keith.
We'll address this. If you'd like the version of the PDF version of the toolkit, and you've not already said so in the chat, please do ask. I'll try and keep a note of who's asking, perhaps with the help of colleagues from the committee who are monitoring the chat. If you'd rather contact me offline, then you're very welcome to do so if you want to email me or phone me. The phone number reaches me if I'm working from home. So you're welcome to do that if you'd rather do that than email me. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Keith. That's absolutely fantastic. We can obviously, what we can do is get the attendance list and email around the entire attendance list if you're happy.
Why not?
With that. Yeah,
happy with that, very much so.
Rather than sort of trying to create a list, then those that don't want it can ignore it and do it that way. It may even be that is there any particular reason why it's hidden behind a login, and it can be posted on, if we're putting the video to this session on our website, we could maybe add it to the UHMLG site?
I don't see why not. I think it's only that.
Feel free to check. Obviously, you may want to just double
check.
I
will check. I think it's only the way that we've structured our website. We got a new website during the summer last year, and it was all put on SharePoint, and quite a lot of it isn't accessible to some people who would want it. Don't quote me on that. But all our stuff about systematic reviewing, for example, can't be seen by the students. We're working on that. So no, I don't think there's any particular reason why not. I'll check, but I think that's quite likely.
We're certainly happy to send it around to, if you're happy, to the participants of this session, and perhaps in due course on our website as well. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Yes. So if you said in the chat you'd like it, we'll send it to everyone. And as Isla says, if you didn't want it, just delete the email. That would be fine. Fab.
That's really generous. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that insight into a really practical tool that can be used against any course, and in particular against medicine. So really, really helpful. There's lots of love going on in the chat, and thanks. Caroline, do you want to go through some of the questions that
thanks very much, Keith. I think the first thing to say is that there's lots of people sharing lots of resources, so as an adjunct we can make sure those resources are put up too, I think. So there will be a growth of the resources available. Excellent. One of the first comments was around support for international students, and I think that's a market in which lots of us on this call are involved, and lots of those international courses are of course run online, so making sure that resources are relevant is so important. I don't know if you've got any comments around that.
Yes, I think that's definitely an issue, isn't it? As I was saying, I think for us, well, I would have thought that the international students on our health courses would be on the master's courses that I mentioned, because I know I meet the quality and safety students, that's the face-to-face course, and there's some kind of arrangement with either the government or the health ministry in Saudi Arabia that students come to Leicester to do the course. With the diabetes course, I have less contact with, except with students as individuals, and that's distance learning. So some people are very local, some people are rather less local. But I think it's been flagged up as an issue with the undergraduate healthcare courses more recently, and possibly with medicine, but certainly with healthcare, where there are international students. So I met the physiotherapy students face to face recently, and there's quite a cohort within that from, I think, from China. And what support there is given from the university as a whole to those students when they start the course. So I think maybe this toolkit would prompt or help people when they're examining, looking at their reading list. So maybe if I'm picking on a healthcare course to try it out with, if they're willing to, maybe a physiotherapy course might be a thought. Yes.
Particularly since it raises up so many questions of language and
yes.
local source and accessibility in a different language and all of those other things, and possible alternative methods of treatment. And so
yes,
ticks all the boxes, doesn't it?
I know that the master's students, I think those on the diabetes course who are from outside the UK, of course, that they're doing their dissertations related to something of interest to them in their home country, and I imagine there might be things on their reading list that relate to those countries, because they do tend to put journal articles on the list. But with the physiotherapy students, I'm not sure whether they're staying in the UK or whether they will go back. I don't know. I need to find out. Be useful to know.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think there are lots of great comments, lots of great resources going up in the chat, Keith. So thank you very much.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think what I've been wondering, if I can beg a question from the chair's privilege and all that, is have you seen changes happening? Is it being actually implemented in practice yet? Have you seen changes to reading lists already taking place, and people going, oh my goodness, I hadn't even realized I can source other material?
I think for us it's too early to say, because the final this final draft, which isn't a final draft, of course, we'll alter it and amend it if in the light of feedback and experience. But it's also new that we're really at the stage where we're trying to make sure that everyone knows about it, and when mentioning it at these meetings, and when we meet new staff, mentioning it to them. I do know that some of the resources that the MedRace group have flagged up, they have certainly gone on into the reading lists for medicine. Medicine use the reading list system rather differently, like they do lots of other things, of course, from anyone else. But there's things that have gone onto the list there that have also gone onto the other lists in healthcare, which I tend to maintain. So it's made a difference, but that's possibly because I've been able to do it. So it'd be really interesting to see what impact it has. Absolutely. It'll be something for us to monitor, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every university has academics who are the publishers and the authors of the books that occasionally, surprise, end up on a reading list. I wonder if there's been any, I'm sure there's a long tail to this sort of change, as to whether the publishers are aware of these sorts of decision-making choice tools in terms of putting the material on, and it increases the chance of their material getting onto a reading list if it accommodates and changes and incorporates greater diversity.
Yeah. And
to put a bit of weight behind the editors or the authors of the work, putting the weight on the publishers. Yeah, that would be interesting. I've seen some of the aggregators have collections, particularly of EDI, DEI interest, which is the kind of thing we might consider at the Inclusive Collections Group. But I'm seeing emails from individual publishers where they're flagging up things that they're buy this new book because
publishing. That's right. Yes. So for more inclusive teaching and so on. So yes, something to look out for. Fantastic. I put up the links to your MedRace, the two MedRace links that were in your slides. I popped those onto the chat as well, and some individual titles are being talked about in terms of alternatives to add to the range of the Mind the Gap dermatology book
alternatives are being popped up in relation to that as well, which is really helpful, because sometimes it's just some practical solutions. You can't recommend something, you can't get something on a reading list if it doesn't exist, but just knowing that it exists and seeing the different dermatology reading list in University A versus University B is sometimes part of the solution, isn't it? It's like, oh gosh, I hadn't been aware that book had been published, and just sharing that is conceivably a useful thing as well. Have you spotted another question, Carolyn?
I think Ruth from Edinburgh is asking about whether you've actually found that your library collection as a result of doing this work was diverse enough, or has it led to other material being purchased? Has it highlighted, you know, gaps? And I guess also, have you had the resources to be able to purchase them?
There's the question.
Good question.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the impact of this toolkit, because it's such a new thing, it might be a bit early to tell, but the Inclusive Collections Group at the meetings, we meet once a month, and we've certainly spotted things in the unsolicited print gifts which are offered to the library, which we feel have a potential to diversify and decolonise the collections. So that's having an impact. Obviously, that's work within the library. There have been collections of things which have been bought with the sort of end of year money, which we've had, which have turned out to have this sort of potential as well. So we will look at those things that we've already bought to see if they have that kind of potential. And then that's a question of publicising those to the people who would need to know. There'll be people who are interested in them, that's why we've bought them, but there might be other people who would find them valuable as well. So I think it's, monitoring the impact of all of this, I think would be, it's definitely a future project, maybe a future Library Champions project, you know, for the next intake.
Yeah, more funding.
Yes. So yes, the funding question. We've had no extra funding to spend on diversifying, decolonising the collection. So the end of year funding would be money that we had anyway down the back of the proverbial sofa. And we've been aware of the sort of things that we might get to make the collections more diverse. Other things that we've bought have come out of existing book funds. So if there's something that we've been aware of as academic librarians that has that sort of potential, it would come out of the money we would have used to support that subject area. And one of the things, this I guess is why we're looking in the unsolicited print gifts, of course, because there may be things there that we wouldn't have known about, but also that we might not have bought. But also we're on the lookout for free online resources. So the Mind the Gap resource, which the link for which is in the slide, that's the thing that's gone on to all the reading lists in healthcare and medicine. And it was MedRace that spotted that first, actually. So that was something that they made me aware of. I made the School of Healthcare aware of it because MedRace is a medical school thing, and it's gone onto everyone's list as a thing, and hopefully is being promoted by academics as well.
Thank you, Keith. I think just to carry on the conversation about resources in a sense, Jane from Anglia Ruskin makes the comment that actually, yes, maybe we do need to look at our donations a bit more carefully. And, you know, I'm certainly one of those who tends to say, oh, thanks, and then put it to Book Harvest or whatever I do without paying that much attention to the boxes that arrive in my office. But yeah, they might contain some gems. Equally, they may be horrifying. So I think it could be either, couldn't it?
It could. We I think had gone, not to be minuted as they say, but we'd gone to possibly the other extreme with gifts, in that we'd maybe, unofficially my own private viewpoint, we'd kind of arrived at the point where people would come along and say, would you like all these books? And our immediate response was to say, oh no, thank you, no, we can't take donations. We were worried, and justifiably so, I know, about the workload of my colleagues who would have to process all of these donations. But I think we had gone too far that way. And we're now going more back the other way. We're rewriting our gifts policy to make it clear that, you know, to try and make it clear that if you are a graduating medical student, this is quite a common source of donations, and you wish to donate the books which you used as a student, that's very kind of you, but possibly they won't be the most up-to-date edition. And so we may not be interested. But on the other hand, you know, we'd rather hear about stuff because as Caroline says, there might be something in there, and there have been things in there that have turned out to be really, you know, about really important figures or about quite important topics, looking at them in a different way. So I think it's good we've kind of rebalanced ourselves a bit, I think, which is good.
There's a comment in the chat from Marshall. She has run an assessment, critical appraisal, within 2 different courses, and sometimes it's tough, isn't it? It's difficult to find papers which are relevant and challenging, but they've kept going with it, and the students seem to be appreciating it, as well as the teaching staff. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's almost like the trinity of working together, student, staff and library staff to achieve this, which is really exciting, but also fairly terrifying at times.
Yes.
And I think there was a question too about how do you work with the publishers to get them to be more inclusive with what they're publishing and offering us?
Yeah, I don't know that we've done much of that. I don't know if anything's going on in the wider library world. What we have noticed when looking at the free resources when we meet as the Inclusive Collections Group is a number of open access books, which should prove to be of great potential interest. And some of those get automatically added into our library system because of where they're hosted, I think. So maybe as open access monograph publishing gets more of a thing, maybe that's something that will help. But maybe, yeah, I mean, the UK Serials Group did have a meeting, which we presented at last year about EDI, DEI issues. And so publishers, of course, will be involved in that group. So maybe there are places where publishers may pick up the interest. It won't be news to them, I'm sure, but where we can work with each other.
Yeah, you think as a potential new source of income, a new edition with more diverse photographs or greater inclusivity in terms of examples, or the case studies that are included as part of a textbook that change some of the surnames that might present a slightly wider spread of society. You'd think they'd be absolutely going, oh, that means that everybody has to buy this new book. Excellent, ka-ching, money-wise. It seems like for not a massive amount of change or not a massive amount of cost to change some photographs and to change some text examples, so it's not just always an obviously white patient case study that's given as an example in these chapters or whatever.
Yeah,
you'd think they'd be going,
yes,
this is a money spinner and then some.
Yes,
but
I've not tried. I must try. Well, in fact, if I trial the toolkit with areas that I work with, that might well be a way for me to examine editions of the standard textbooks to see if these things are, how these things are tackled, if you like.
Yeah.
So whether all the images are, how diverse the examples and the names are. So I'd like to think that they were, like material that's presented to school students has much more diverse range of names in, from my experience of my son's work, who's 14, compared with what it was like when I was at school ages ago. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see. But yes, I think so.
I see there's a very nice challenge from Marshall to ask the reps searching questions about exactly what they're selling us and why they're not selling us more appropriate and more diverse material at this stage. Good on you. Love a challenge, Marshall.
I like that challenge. We'd had the thought as Inclusive Collections Group of asking, it was Boxer Broadcasts and Canopy, two sort of providers of television and radio content and films, if they did anything about warning people about the content of those things and the language. And that's something we'll ask the reps when we meet them, but maybe when we meet with reps from the publishers of the more book material, those are things we could certainly ask, aren't they? I like that idea very much.
Or it's not just this material may contain violence and sexual content. It's a case of this material is fundamentally based around a white lived experience of privilege, and some of you may find this deeply biased.
Yes, so there's the language side, isn't there, and the portrayal side, but also how representative that content is. Yeah, I've made a note.
And call to arms. ask us all to be asking publishers, where is the books that we need to make ourselves more diverse and to make the experience and the reading more diverse. Are there any other questions? Last chance for Keith, but we're going to be getting a whole load of good stuff in terms of the checklist to share around, as well as the slides and the recording, obviously. So any other questions, anyone? Otherwise, thank you, Mr. Keith Nockels, very much indeed. It's been a pleasure to hear about it. It's really solid and comprehensive work, and I very much look forward to seeing the detail of it, and obviously seeing how it might be applied against local collections and local reading lists. Thank you
very
so
much. Thanks everyone for your comments and
really appreciate
questions. Much appreciated.
Lots of appreciation going on in the chat, and good comments as well. Thank you so much.